Hi, I'm Deborah Bernhard with the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission. I'm going to share a bit about what vulnerable mission looks like on the ground when lived out by a missionary. Western missionaries often feel that they need to bring something tangible in order to benefit those they serve in the global South. This often causes them to miss seeing the rich resources, languages, and cultures that are already present. God gave the languages and resources to the people, and their methods are sustainable and reproducible, while ours often are not. For example, building homes or clean water systems that require outside funding to be built and maintained are not sustainable or reproducible, can cause envy and rivalry, and create dependency. Restricting oneself to local means can feel like it's contrary to what supporters and even locals expect, and can feel like a difficult step to take. It definitely requires a lot of faith, willingness to go against the status quo, openness to learning, and accepting ways that are different from our own. Let's look at a couple examples from the context of evangelism and church planting. The missionary, instead of getting outside funds to buy land and build a church, lets people meet in their homes or in the village square. Or instead of leading the church, the missionary can encourage mature believers to lead in their own way. Behaving in a way that could be viewed as pushy or legalistic or paternalistic by local people isn't helpful. Western missionaries often aren't aware that they can be perceived this way, as locals who are benefiting from the missionary's resources are reluctant to speak up. Also, when the missionary isn't able to understand the exchanges between locals in their native language, the missionary can miss a lot of important context and cultural clues. In a pioneering situation where there's no established church among the people being reached, missionaries need to be careful not to introduce Western forms of church or even Western ways of explaining the gospel. This requires a lot of reflection and cultural insight on the part of the missionary. Some examples are: instead of translating Western songs or books, rather encourage people to naturally express worship and teaching in their own way. Oral, hierarchical cultures are not something we need to undo, but rather allow Christ to be present within them. Using stories, as Jesus did, rather than Western, linear, or book-based teaching styles is another example. Lay leaders can and should take the lead in sharing the gospel with and baptizing each other, rather than the outsider. When the missionary is in charge of this, it can communicate favoritism and imply that they will get money and status from the West if they convert. This can also be magnified when evangelists and pastors receive their salaries from the West. The fact that Christians are often culturally westernized also contributes to this perception. What the ecclesia looks like in a pioneering situation also needs to be considered by the vulnerable missionary. The biblical necessities of the gathering, such as teaching, prayer, worship, community, etc., might all look very different from these things in a Western setting. So much so that they may hardly be recognizable to an outsider. Missionaries need to ask themselves what things will look like 5 or 10 years down the road if they do things a certain way now, in the beginning. The God-given community and identity that is already present needs to be honored. This can mean evangelizing whole families, meeting together in the home, not separating believers from non-believers so that the gospel can take root. Extraction from the community usually leads to division and the missionary ending up in a bubble surrounded only by Christians. Being humble and vulnerable in our approach often means that things will feel messy, chaotic, unfamiliar, or uncomfortable. Since we usually feel more comfortable with what we can control, understand, or what is familiar, letting go of these things requires vulnerability and usually indicates that we're getting something right by allowing local ways to be more prominent. These are some examples of what vulnerable mission can look like practically. The main point is being willing to give up control and prominence and operating within the local parameters, community, and way of life. A posture of vulnerability requires flexibility, putting others first, willingness to give up our own ways, and the ability to see deeply into other cultures, languages, and ways of life.